Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Natural Super Kids podcast. Today I am joined by a guest, Morgan Hammond, who is a speech pathologist. And we are specifically talking to Morgan today about how oral dysfunction can lead to feeding difficulties such as picky eating and fussy eating. And we talk about how these feeding difficulties relate to breathing and a child's sleep, their behaviour, and of course their nutrition. Morgan also shares some tips on what to look for when, seeking out help from a speech pathologist when it comes to oral dysfunction and feeding issues, because it's not something we often, or many of us often think about a speech pathologist being able to help with. So here's Morgan. Hello, Morgan. Thank you so much for joining me.
No worries at all. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited.
I'm really excited about this chat too. I think our listeners are going to love this one. So can you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be doing the work you're doing today?
Yeah. So I am, first and foremost, I'm a mum. I've got two young boys. So I've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. So very much in the thick of little kids. So 2 boys. Yeah. And I am a speech language pathologist and I work in private practice. And I have a particular interest in early intervention and feeding as well. So, so the thing that got me, I guess, into this area was mainly that drive of having your own children. I think when you've got your own experiences and personal experiences, it really does drive you to have a particular interest in a certain area. Yeah.
Definitely. That was my story as well. My kids are a bit older than yours. I've got a 12 and a 14-year-old. So we're in those fun teenage years.
Yeah. Just don't tell me that I'm blocking my ears.
But I'm really interested because I don't think a lot of people would link a speech pathologist and feeding therapy. So Tell us a little bit more about what motivated you to branch into feeding therapy besides, being a mum yourself.
Yeah. So a lot of people don't realize that speech pathologists are also, that's my... I'm so sorry.
An interruption from a little person. That's absolutely fine. We keep it real here.
Yes, that was my 4-year-old. Okay, so what motivated me to get into this area? So, yes, a lot of people don't realize that speech pathologists also get involved with feeding. So we work with anything communication, but we also work with swallowing as well. So obviously we have that in-depth knowledge of anatomy of head and neck. And that's a really big area for speech pathologists is to be involved in swallowing, which obviously leads into, you've got that oral phase of the swallowing. So I work more in that area. So it leads into a bit of feeding therapy as well. So yeah.
So in your private practice, are you seeing predominantly like kids that are struggling with feeding? Tell us a bit more about the sorts of kids that you're helping.
Yeah. So feeding is definitely something that does come up because a lot of people seek out speech pathologists for obviously your speech and language side of things, communication side of things. As I ask more questions, it's very, very common that they're so picky. They've got such a restricted diet. In the beginning, I was in education when I had first graduated. So I did kind of stick to that traditional speech pathology route of speech, language, literacy side of things. I learned the basics at uni, did do placements with swallowing and feeding, but didn't really do it in the beginning. But then bring in your own kids. They've both got personally have had some difficulties with their feeding. And then we've had obviously all the normal picky eating developmental stages as well. And as you start to, I guess, have your own kids and you have to, you realize how much stress can come around meal times and can come around not wanting to eat a particular thing, or going to the in-laws or your parents or whatever, and your kid's not eating properly, and all of that pressure. So I think that my own kids really did kind of get me into it. And then as you, in a clinical setting, as you're asking more questions and putting all those pieces together of the whole child, that then kind of put it together for me. And I then did go into more feeding therapy, which I absolutely love. So all of those, when you look at all the research on the socioeconomic outcomes, the mental health outcomes on kids that just share a meal together and do have that varied diet, it's just amazing. So I love that aspect of it, of working with the families to try and bring that family anxiety down and get some more nutrition happening and get that kid participating in meal times.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, as you know, before we become mums, we have this vision of sitting around the table, you know, lovely conversation with our kids, eating the food that we put in front of them. But I know here at Natural Super Kids, like, it's one of the biggest challenges that we hear from parents is the picky eating, the fussy eating. So can you tell us a bit more about how feeding difficulties can relate to breathing, to sleep, to behaviour, and to nutrition?
Okay, so this one is a big question. I feel like it can be something that could be covered over like a 4-day PD or something like that. I'll try and very kind of succinctly give a bit of a taster of it. But so there's lots of components to feeding therapy. So I obviously will work on the environment, so work on getting a really good routine happening, giving the parents some pointers of different language that they can use around food. So trying to take that pressure down, bring the anxiety down in the parent, bring the anxiety down in which therefore then brings anxiety down in the child. So I do work a lot on that, on even just having that exposure. So even if the child won't eat melon, strawberries, carrot, anything like that, but working on having that exposure there of all different types of food, getting the child involved in meal prep and things like that. So that's a massive component. The area that I work with mostly is more around that oral dysfunction. So when I say oral dysfunction, that's where they don't actually have the adequate skills for feeding development. So no matter what foods you give them, if they don't have the skill, they can't eat it. So there might be a raw carrot. If they don't have that oral motor skill to be able to chew on that carrot, they won't eat it. So no matter how much exposure you have, no matter how good the environment factors are, you really need to work on those skills of it feeding as well. So I do work mainly in that space, but obviously everything else ties in with it as well. So with that oral dysfunction, there's a lot of different causes of it. So it's generally there's a medical, underlying medical difficulty. So it could be that they've got ENT issues. So if you think a child that's chronically sort of blocked up, they're not breathing optimally. If you think of when you have a cold and you're chewing a piece of steak, and a piece of steak's going to take a long time for you to chew, and you're like, are you having to stop to take breaths through your mouth? It can make it difficult and they're not going to enjoy it. So those ENT kids that have got a lot going on in their airways, that can really impact. Obviously gut is a big one as well, which is coming out a lot more lately, which is awesome that that people are more aware. If you don't feel good in your gut, you are not going to be wanting to eat. So if you're associating nausea, discomfort, pain, even if they are constipated because of the lack of diet, like lack of variety in their diet, they then got constipation, their hunger signals get impacted, and they aren't going to feel comfortable and wanting to sit down and have a meal and try different things. Allergies also can have an impact. Sensory needs, so different sensory needs that the kids might have. They might want something that's really crunchy and loud. They might want something that's not so, doesn't have such a strong flavor. They might really like cold things but not hot things. So all of that can play into it. which makes it quite complex.
Yeah, but I guess someone like you can help people get to the bottom of what's going on, because for a parent that can be really confusing. Why will they only eat, this particular food? Like, it's really hard to get to the bottom of that as a parent.
Yeah, because you can provide them with everything. You can do all, like I was saying before, you can do all those amazing things, like provide the exposure and have all the foods there and provide it, but they may not have the skills to be able to do it. So so it's kind of having that piece of the puzzle in there as well. So, and also, even if all of these things are resolved, so say they do have really enlarged adenoids or tonsils, which is impacting their breathing, a lot of the time, excuse me, a lot of the time, if they've had these patterns for a long period and formed these habits of kind of mouth breathing while eating, everything gets resolved medically, everything gets removed by surgery and things like that, they may still keep these bad habits going. Also, their oromotor, their structures in their oral cavity can grow differently in the period where they were impacted by this medical issue. So, you can often have these difficulties linger and stay around even after medical intervention. So that's why it's important. And you've also then had a prolonged period of time when negative associations may have been formed at meal times. So if you think, excuse me, if you think for like say there's been a year or something like that, they've had some ENT issues, and every mealtime is a stress. Every mealtime is annoying. Every mealtime, everyone's anxiety is high. There's a lot of pressure, or you've gone into bad habits of putting a television on to make them eat and things like that. Just anything you can do to get by, or bribing with dessert just to get them to eat that extra bit of broccoli. All of those things, those environmental things, you can see how they all really commonly can come in those times of distress around eating. So those all play a big factor. You've also got like they're not then developing their motor patterns while they have a restricted diet. They're not developing new motor patterns to be able to take on trickier foods. So they're kind of stagnant in that delayed oromotor pattern. Like I said before, they've got negative associations with food. They might have done a lot of gagging. They might have been vomiting, and it can just be a really stressful, awful time for families. So
it's really complex. And I love what you said. Like, even if you get to the bottom of what's going on, like if it's a medical issue and that gets resolved, it doesn't mean that the feeding issue will just change like that overnight.
No, definitely not. And I guess that's where you look at that sleep and behaviour and things like that. You can see how if you've got limited nutritional intake, that's going to be impacting on your behaviour. That's going to be impacting on good quality sleep. If they have breathing difficulties, they're not going to be sleeping that well because they're probably going to be snoring, mouth breathing, not getting really good quality sleep, which then also impacts behaviour the next day. So it is all very much intrinsically connected. So that's where that really thorough kind of initial consultation to get that really good picture of the child and all of those basic functions, feeding, sleep, behaviour, all of that, and kind of asking about all those different elements. So,
and it can really be a negative cycle, can't it? Like you said, with the constipation, this is something we see commonly at Natural Super Kids, constipated kids, and they're fussy, and that causes more constipation because they're not getting the diversity of fibers and things in there. So it's really like first and foremost figuring out what's going on with
what came first, the chicken or the egg. And
yes, exactly. And then addressing the cause, but then also knowing that it's not going to sort of change overnight. And I imagine that, do you work with other professionals as well? Or,
it's very much a multidisciplinary approach. So I guess the speech pathology side of things, we work on that. The motor skills, we work on motor skills, we work on the actual like feeding therapy, working on the environment and things like that. But we do really rely on occupational therapists to help us with the sensory side of things. In terms of the medical causes, so you really rely heavily on your gastroenterologists, your ENTs, dentists for like if they need tongue tie releases, if there's something there oromotor-wise that is being impacted by the tongue tie or lip ties and things like that. And obviously then your nutritionists and dietitians to work in with saying, all right, this is where they're at oromotor-wise. they're having difficulties with this type of food, what can we get happening that's kind of at their level, and get them to have a bit of a play around with that to make sure we're getting really optimum nutrition in there. So, yeah, it is very much a multidisciplinary team. Even body workers, physios, osteopaths, chiropractors, getting their help. If there is any issues with the structures of the head or neck, they've got extra tension on one side, or all of that plays into it as well. So, yeah, it's very much a multidisciplinary approach.
Yeah. And even though this is very complex, and some parents listening might go, oh, where do I even start?
It is very complex. Yeah.
But at least, like, you know, it can also be assuring for parents to know that these things are common, and eating, like, I think we expect it to be something that comes really naturally to kids, and it does to most kids, but it's actually quite complicated, eating, the process
it is
of
so
eating.
Complicated. Like I said, you can have all those environmental impacts, you can have motor problems, you can have sensory issues that are causing it. Like, there's so many different root causes of feeding difficulties. So
yes, and I think for parents out there to know that, you know, there are all these different types of professionals that can help. So if you've been seeking help and you haven't really gotten very far, then maybe it's time to look at a bit of a different approach.
Yeah.
So how do we know, you know, what are some of the things that we should be looking out for when it comes to this oral dysfunction? How do we know that our kids are not just kind of fussy, picky eaters, or there's something more going on?
Yeah. I always say to parents, if you are in doubt, if it is causing you anxiety or stress, just ask the question. Just go see somebody and ask the question, because there's nothing worse than having that gut feeling as a parent, being stressed about it, and someone saying, oh, my son was like that at that age. He'll grow out of it. He'll be fine. It can just be very reassuring to reach out to a professional and say, look, I feel like this. I need a little bit of help, and just getting them to check everything over. Some of the main things to look out for is obviously if they do have gut issues, if they're complaining about discomfort, if there's vomiting, if there's constipation and things like that. Looking into their sleep. So is your child a mouth breather during the day, or especially when sleeping? Are they mouth breathing? Are they snoring? Are they up a lot? Having nightmares? That kind of indicates that they're having a very light sleep. Do they have a restricted diet, which is obviously a big one that gets the ball rolling? What does the restriction look like? So if you're noticing a child's only eating very easy to eat foods like a chicken nugget or yogurt, or just those really soft foods, if they're preferencing that, how long does it take them to eat? If your child takes a really long time to eat, that can be a sign that they're having difficulty with their oromotor movements when eating. Are they a messy eater? That can sometimes indicate that they're having a bit of difficulty with controlling the food. Are they spitting food out? Is there gagging? Are they pocketing food? Like they'll put food into the sides of their mouth. Do they have food left in their mouth after they've swallowed? Can also be indicators. So I don't know if I've gone on a bit of a tangent, but those are things that my main advice would be to parents. So if you are in doubt, just ask the question. Just go and speak to somebody. You will not regret having a consult with somebody and, getting some advice. You will never regret it, because you might get the help that you need, or you might get that reassurance that things are okay, or what to look out for if it lasts for a certain amount of time. So,
yeah. And I think what you said before is really relevant. You know, you want to get on top of this stuff as soon as possible so they don't build on those kind of negative habits, right?
Yeah. And while they're developing as well, you want them to think of their growth and their patterns that they're forming in their oral cavity. You really, want to get on it when they're in that childhood stage and when they're younger, as young as possible.
Yeah. So many things to think about. That is,
that's
great. And so do you have any advice in terms of finding the right professional? Like if someone out there is listening and going, I really want to find a speech pathologist in my area that has experience with feeding.
Yeah. I would be just asking the question of, are you confident with feeding therapy? or so not just booking in, because there are some, like myself, I didn't do feeding therapy in the first few years out of university. I was in a different field and have only gone into it in the last few years. And back when I was doing education, things like that, I wouldn't have been able to really provide much on feeding, but the basics that I learned at university. So asking the questions, I have a problem eater. Do you have anyone that works with feeding? So
that's same
with OTs and everything as well. So do you have anyone that works with feeding therapy?
Yes, because these sort of like modalities and professionals, they're quite broad, you know.
So broad, yeah.
So important to find someone who's got that experience in feeding. Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your wisdom.
Oh, I loved it. Yeah, hopefully it was helpful. I mean, it's a big topic, but hopefully it's a little bit of a taster of things to, just to be a bit more mindful of moving forward. So
definitely. And just to plant those seeds and give parents hope that, you know, there is things that can be done. And fussy eating isn't normally, like it's not always, actually it's more often not just your child being, you know, a pain in the bum.
There is there is always usually something underlying outside of those normal developmental picky eating phases. There's something underlying happening there.
Yeah, so thank you for shedding light on this topic.
No worries. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.